Hello and welcome back to Kim Reads' Continuous Secret of Shadow Ranch. Chapter 3, Warning Rattle. "We're stranded!" Bess exclaimed in dismay. George stared at the empty thermos jug unbelievingly. "It can't be," said George. "Shorty Steele promised to fill that jug with water." "He must have forgotten," said Bess. She peered up and down the road, but there was no vehicle in sight. Nancy tried to sound unworried as she spoke. "We might as well get into the car and wait for the water in the radiator to cool off, or maybe somebody will come along and help us." She placed the radiator cap. "If we're not on the ranch for supper, Uncle Ed or someone will drive out and look for us," Bess remarked hopefully. Time dragged by as the girls waited. Nancy tested the water twice. It was still boiling hot. They might have to wait until evening, and was not keen about the idea of driving in a strange desert after dark. "It's like an oven in this wagon," Bess complained. "Hotter outside," George mumbled. Suddenly the girls spotted a speck moving towards them on a dusty road. With relief, the girls watched it take shape as a pickup truck. "It's from the ranch!" George yelled and dashed outside. Bess followed, and when the truck stopped, she cried out, "Dad Gregory, you're a lifesaver. I was about to die of thirst and sunstroke." With a grin, the tall, rangy cowboy swung down from the truck cab. Quickly, Bess introduced him to Nancy. Dave's handsome face grew stern when Bess and George explained what happened. He pushed his hat back, hooked his thumbs to his belt, and said, "Just what I figured. 3 little dudes stuck high and dry. Mr. Raleigh warned you to check your water supply before you went out in the desert." "But Shorty promised he'd take care of it," said George. Dave's eyes narrowed for an instant, then he said casually, "Well, this is dangerous country. You check your own gear if you know what's good for you." "We're sorry you had to come out after us," Nancy apologized. "Mr. Raleigh's orders," he said coolly, and strode to the truck. In a minute, Dave was back in a large can with a thermos jug, in which he handed to the girls. While they drank gratefully, he poured water from the can into the radiator on the ranch wagon. He put the cap back and slammed the hood. The girls returned the jug and thanked him. Dave gave a curt nod and walked to the truck and swung aboard. By the time Nancy had the car started, the pickup had turned around and gone roaring down ahead of them. "What's eating him?" George burst out. "He was about as friendly to you, Nancy, as a prairie dog." Nancy smiled. "Never mind," she said. "I can see his point." She wondered, however, what the trouble was. She had not even reached the ranch, and already 2 people had been mysterious and unfriendly to her. She followed the truck down the highway and finally onto a road which wound through the barren hills at the foot of the mountains. It was nearly sunset when the girls entered a rocky pass and came out of a valley. At the far side became a huge mountain with a group of low buildings nestled at its foot. Bess pointed at them. "There's the ranch, and that's Shadow Mountain." "I see how they got their names," said Nancy. "The great peak throws its shadow over the whole valley." Half an hour later, they drove through a weather-beaten wooden gate into the ranch yard. Nancy pulled up to the ranch house, a long, 1-story abode building with a vine-covered portion across the front. To the north of the house were the corral and stable. Beyond these stretched a large meadow bordered by a wire fence. In the opposite direction lay the bunkhouse, and south of this, some distance away, a smaller enclosed meadow. In it cattle were grazing. A stocky, sunburned man and a slender, dark-haired woman hurried out to greet the girls as they alighted. "Bess, George!" exclaimed Elizabeth Raleigh. "We were so worried, and this must be Nancy. We're very glad to see you." She gave her guest a huge smile, but the girls could see the strained look in her eyes. Mr. Raleigh took Nancy's hand in his large one and said cordially, "I'm mighty glad to know you." "And I'm glad we're here," Nancy replied. Her house gathered the suitcases and led the way toward the house. Suddenly, Nancy heard ferocious barking and turned to see a huge black dog bounding toward her. Behind him ran Dave Gregory. "Chief," he shouted, "come back here." With a snarl, the dog stopped short and began circling Nancy, snapping and barking. She did not move as the animal grew calmer. Then, as she spoke to him softly, he sniffed her hand. Moments later, Nancy was stroking his thick fur. He was a handsome black German shepherd, the largest Nancy had ever seen. The others had been looking at Juan in amazement. "Young lady," said Red Raleigh, "I like the way you stood your ground." "How about it, Dave?" "Pretty good for a tenderfoot," the cowboy admitted, and then said, "Come along, sheep. Your job is chasing coyotes away from the chickens." Obediently, the dog trotted away at the far end of the yard. "The dog's full name is Apache Chief," said Elizabeth Raleigh. She led the girls onto the portico. Just then, a slender girl with dark curly hair and big, sad-looking eyes stepped from the house. Bess introduced her as their cousin Alice. She said hello to Nancy, and Charlie followed the others down the portico to Bess and George's room, which Nancy was to share. Another door led into the main hallway of the house. Mr. Raleigh followed with the luggage. When the travelers had showered and put on fresh dresses, they heard a loud clanging from outside. "That's the cook ringing for supper," Alice explained to Nancy. The girls hurried off to the kitchen at the far end of the house. Outside, the screen door hung an iron triangle, still swinging. The big room was crowded with men who stood around a long oval table and a red checkered tablecloth on it. Nancy was introduced to a tall, thin man with some bleached hair. "This is Walt Sanders, my foreman," said Mr. Raleigh, "and some of my men." Sanders shook Nancy's hand. Shorty Steele, a husky, middle-aged cowboy, did the same. Next, good-looking, red-haired cowboy was introduced as Tex Britton, and his dark-haired pal as Bud Moore. With a glance, Bess informed Nancy that these two were the nice cowboys she had told her about. "Grub's ready," called a high, shrill voice. "Everybody sit down." A small woman with frizzy gray hair and a white apron bustled from the stove to the table bearing a big platter of steaming meat. "This is Mrs. Thurman, our cook," said the ranch owner's wife. In the confusion of taking seats, George had a chance to ask for Shorty about the water he had promised to put out in the station wagon. The cowboy's sun-tanned face showed surprise. "No, ma'am, I never said I'd do that," he declared. "You must have mistook my meaning." He repeated this denial several times. Nancy overheard Shorty and thought he was overdoing it. She wondered if the misunderstanding might not have been part of a plan to scare away the girls away from the ranch. After serving a hearty meal of roast beef, beans, cornflakes, and salad, Mrs. Thurman produced 2 delicious large apple pies. When the last bite had been eaten, Ed Raleigh arose and there was silence. "Okay, man," he said brusquely. "Who has the first watch?" "Me and Dave," replied Shorty, and the two left the kitchen together. Quietly, the rest of the men arose, and Mrs. Raleigh led the girls through a door into a large living room. Like the kitchen, it ran from the front to the back of the house. Among the comfortable furnishings were several slim, old-fashioned rockers and a round center table with a brass lamp on it. Bright-colored Indian rugs lay on the floor. At one end of the room was a huge stone fireplace. "Tradition says that all the rocks in it have come from Shadow Ranch," Alice told Nancy. She pointed to a smooth round stone. "That's an Indian grinding stone." At the opposite end of the room, beside a door leading to the portico, was a deep window. In front of it, the shelves stood rows of colored antique bottles. "This is a lovely place," Nancy exclaimed. "We're sorry you can't stay to enjoy it," said Mrs. Raleigh as her husband entered from the kitchen. "Yes," he added, "but it's too dangerous. We're under attack. We can't figure out by whom or why. I can only know if the damage keeps on, we won't be able to stand the expense. We'll lose Shadow Ranch." Mrs. Raleigh explained that the sheriff could not spare a man to be a full-time guard of the ranch, so her husband and the hands took turns standing watch. "Perhaps you have enemies who want revenge on you," Nancy suggested. "Or maybe property has hidden value." The owner replied that he could not not think of nothing to support either theory. Nancy then described the man at the airport and told him what happened. "The note's in your knitting bag," Ness spoke up. "I'll get it." She hurried to the girls' room and returned Nancy's knitting bag. The young sleuth took out a note, crossed the room to give it to the rancher. Bess started to close to bed. Instead, she idly picked up the half-finished sweater. Underneath it lay a small object loosely wrapped in dirty brown paper. "What's this, Nancy?" she asked as she lifted the wrapping fell off. For a moment, Nancy stared at the thing in her hand, then gave a little cry and flung it from her. Nancy hurried to pick up the object. "The rattle from a snake," she said, holding it up for others to see. "Ugh!" exclaimed Alice. Nancy retrieved the wrapping paper. There was a pencil writing on it. "Second warning," she read out loud. Nancy returned to the grim-faced ranch owner's wife. "Now more than ever," she said, "I want you to solve this mystery. Won't you let me stay and help you?" The rancher looked at her pleading expression and smiled. "We could certainly use a detective, and I gotta hand it to you, Nancy. You sure can keep your head." He glanced at his wife. "What do you say, Bet?" Nancy, Elizabeth Raleigh nodded soberly. "All right, they may stay, but they must promise to be very careful." Eagerly they agreed, and George hastened the telephone in the hall to cancel the plane reservations she had made. In the meantime, Mr. Raleigh said he thought the notes and the snake should be taken to the sheriff the next morning. "I'll go, Mr. Raleigh," said Nancy. "Maybe I should meet him." When George returned, Mrs. Raleigh was saying, "Nancy, I think you should call us Aunt Bet and Uncle Ed. After all, you'll be one of our family." Nancy grinned. "I love that, Aunt Bet. I wish you were going to work on the mystery, too," Alice said wistfully. Nancy took the young girl's hand. "Of course I will," she said kindly, and Alice's blue eyes lit up. Nancy told the Raleighs that she would like to get started with her sleuthing immediately. "May I question your men about the Phantom Horse?" "Yes, indeed," Ed Raleigh agreed. One after the other, the ranch hands were summoned, but none of them could add anything to the information Bess and George had given Nancy. "All these men are new here," Mr. Raleigh told her after they'd gone. "But Walt, Sanders, Tex, and Bud are from an outfit in the next county. Dave's from Montana. Shorty's a drifter." After a little more talk, Bess stifled a yawn, then suggested the girls go to bed. She led the way out of a side door and down a hall to their room. Alice went into the next one. Before long, Bess and George were asleep, but Nancy laid wide-eyed, wondering about Dave Gregory. Why was he so hostile to her? Could he be one of the saboteurs? And what about Shorty? Was he to be trusted? Finally, Nancy fell asleep. Just after midnight, she woke suddenly, startled by a noise on the portico. She sensed someone pushing the door to listen. Then stealthily the footsteps moved on. "Now, what was that about?" Nancy asked herself. Quickly she arose, put on a robe and slippers, and casually opened the screen door. No one was nearby, but at the far end of the portico saw a dark figure slip into the kitchen. Why would anyone be going there from the outdoors at this time of night? Nancy asked herself. I better find out. She wondered if she should awaken the other girls, but decided against this and tiptoed along the portico to the kitchen. She opened the door and stepped into the next room. The next instant, an unearthly shriek split the air and someone seized her. Okay, that's the end of that chapter. See you later.